To another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and I want to dive into training cycles for muscle growth. How long do they need to be? What are some changes we need to make? What does that process look like? How long do I like to keep clients in a training cycle? Do you even need to do training cycles? So I'm going to dive into all that. Because again, that's just a common thing that I see people ask and a question there. First, though, before I dive into that, if you haven't yet, make sure you download my free body recomp checklist. And in that checklist, I go over 10 things you need for body recomp, 2 different types of body recomp, and why it's important to focus on body composition over just scale weight. I also go over some different training splits that I like for this goal. So go and check that out. Again, it's completely free there. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's topic. So again, I want to talk about how long should training cycles be. I'm also going to hit on deloads a little bit. Do you need them? What should a deload look like if you decide to take it? And so really by the end of this, you should have a better idea of like how long your training block should be for muscle growth, and also making sure that we're not overdoing changes or underdoing them, because I definitely see mistakes on both ends. I see too much change, but then also some people maybe feel like they need to stick with something for longer than they need to as well too. So let's talk about why training cycles do matter for muscle growth. Like, why can't you just go in and just lift and be random with lifting and do different things each week? Why is it important to have some sort of structure and cycle when it comes to muscle growth? One, again, these are going to, in my opinion, I do this with clients, but we don't just have random workouts every week. It's not different workouts every single week. We do stay in a training cycle for extended periods of time. The biggest reason, especially when it comes to muscle growth, is it does take some time. Okay. So most early changes from new exercises. So if you do a new exercise and it's like you're gaining 5 pounds per week for the first couple of weeks, a lot of people will assume that's just muscle growth. And maybe there is some muscle growth, but most adaptations that you'll see with new exercises in the first couple of weeks is mostly neurological and not hypertrophy, right? It's just your body's learning how to do that movement and you're getting more efficient at doing that. Again, you will likely see some muscle growth, but again, most of the changes are going to be more like neurological. I guess a good kind of analogy for this literally just came to my head, so I hope this is good, would be like when you get a loan for your house, it's like the first couple of payments that you're making are mostly just interest, right? And then obviously over time, it starts to change. Again, maybe that's not necessarily a one-to-one comparison, but that's how I would essentially think about that there. And so if we're constantly changing exercises, you're always learning movements instead of actually being able to progress them. We're looking at, you probably want to get 2 to 3 weeks in of the same exercise to really get it dialed in terms of the setup, the execution of it, where to set it up, how you do it, how it fits in with the rest of your program. And then from there, that's when you can really start to make your most gains outside of that and really track it, right? Because I've seen for myself and with clients, maybe there's an exercise that we put in that's new and it's, this just doesn't feel good. And a lot of times people will automatically be like, hey, this isn't good for me. I need to switch it out. And then they're like, okay. But then if you actually do it for 2 to 3 sessions, again, now you become more familiar with the setup, how to do it, where you need to place your feet, where you need to place your hands, maybe one little thing that you can manipulate to make it better. And you can really just get in at that point and go and send it to the house there, right? But then on the flip side too, if you are someone that maybe does like a 4-week training cycle, you could do it for 4 weeks. And then you really get one good week of really pushing things, right? And you also see this too, where maybe you do see those good gains at the beginning and then it slows down and then you automatically think, oh crap, I need to switch things up because I'm not making progress like I was initially. But if we go back to what I said, most of the change initially is going to be more on the neurological side of things. And it's just your body getting more efficient at that specific movement there. And then on top of it too, growth does just take time. So it is just a slow process, right? So you, again, may not even see your return on investment on that right off the bat there. Again, we're looking at, okay, so now we know here that we want to have some sort of structure with this from week to week. Most of the gains initially are more neurological, not actually muscle growth. And so if you're constantly switching, it's, again, you could build some muscle, but it's going to be a bit noisier and everything like that, right? Because that's going to be the other thing, is consistency allows for that progressive overload and measurable progress. Like I said, muscle growth is already a slow process. And so if we're also random with the exercises that we're doing, it's just harder to know if you're actually making progress, especially in the short term. Whereas this can tell us the progress that you are making, and it gives us more insight into potential changes that we need to make if things are stalling out or not. Or we're just, again, it gives us more information from that perspective. And it just, that consistency really allows for that progressive overload that you need to build muscle over time there. And again, because it's such a slow process, in the short term, you could think that nothing is working when it really is actually working there. Also, like if you are constantly changing exercises, this could impact like the fatigue around your in the workout, which then is going to impact later movements in the session. And so again, it's hard to know if you're progressing or not. Are you actually getting weaker, or is it just because you're a bit more fatigued? Again, that's why we want to try and keep things consistent there, because that familiarity improves your performance as well too, because again, we can look into things a bit more there. It's like, yeah, your bicep curl didn't go up this week because the first 3 exercises of the workout, you progressed, right? Like from the previous week. So obviously that's going to have an impact on your body there. But again, that familiarity also improves your setup. So, maybe the first week, the first day you do a workout, it's, man, this is a lot. I don't like this. It's taking me too long. But then as you get further into the training cycle, it's like you can shave off 5 to 10 minutes because you know exactly where to put exactly how much weight to use, how you have to have the machine set up or your cable stack or whatever it is, how you're going to feel going into that in most situations, because things are consistent there. And again, I think the load selection is a huge one too. You're not constantly guessing at the load selection, because that takes up a lot. And then it's, am I training hard enough? Am I not? Then if you're doing different exercises and you load up the weight, you're again spending 2 to 3 sets trying to figure that out. And then your rep range could be completely different. And that's why, again, we want to keep things consistent, and why I think it's important from a muscle building standpoint to keep things consistent, and why we want to do training cycles. And saying that doesn't mean that we need to stick with the same exercise forever in the same training cycle and training setup forever either, right? There is going to be that point of diminishing returns where I do think at some point we need to make some adjustments. You can't progress forever with the same setup, right? So overuse or boredom can certainly set in as you do the same exercise over and over. You can become bored of that exercise. Maybe you milked out a lot of gains. It's been in for a while. Now I feel like anytime I do the same exercise for extended periods of time, it's like your weight gets heavy. It's just harder to progress, and everything just feels way tougher in that. And I think the more times that you feel like things are tougher with that exercise, that sort of becomes a learned habit for your brain. And then that exercise, now you associate that with, it just doesn't feel as good over time, right? So exercises can get stale for that reason. You've just done them for so long, or they can cause some minor overuse injuries over time. As you get heavy and progress does slow down, sometimes we can tend to force some progression, and that can lead to some maybe not optimal movement patterns around certain exercises, which can lead to some overuse issues over time. Plus, I think if you do the same exact setup over time, you do start to do movements maybe in specific ways, or just the way your body's set up or the way your machine's set up, it can start to maybe place some stress on certain joints, muscles, more than if you just consistently do that, right? Whereas if you do switch things up regularly, you probably would avoid that. So again, this is a case for, okay, we do need to switch things up at some time, because you can start to see some overuse injuries there. I definitely think the more limited selection you have in terms of equipment, you start to see this kind of pop up in multiple ways, right? Like you start to get a little bored with what you're doing. You also start to see some overuse injuries as well too, right? So if you do work out at home, or again, you just have a barbell or dumbbells or something, that's enough to make, and there's some small changes we can make. But this is where I think you'll run into issues just from a boredom standpoint. I know for me, working out at home, it's like I have good variety because we have a cable stack, we have a barbell, we have dumbbells, I have a leg extension, leg curl machine, but I'm still fairly limited if it was my home gym versus going to a normal gym that has different machines, et cetera. Like I can find that I have to be a little bit more strategic with this, and I need to find movements and I need to change up certain movements regularly, because one, I get bored because I don't have as much variety, but then also the overuse injury side of things on there. So psychological refresh does matter, right? So like changing rep ranges or exercise variations does help with motivation. Ask anyone, right? Where I think any client, when I'm like, all right, let's get you in a new training cycle, those first couple of weeks are always super motivating and fun to do different stuff, right? And that definitely matters when we're trying to think about what is the main goal of muscle. Like with muscle growth, what's the one thing we need? We need time. We have to be able to do this for extended periods of time. And if you're finding that psychologically you're not sticking with what you're doing and you're not putting as much into it, it's like that is going to slow it down, which in turn is also going to lower your motivation. So we do need to find that sort of happy medium here in terms of how often we switch. And so again, training variety keeps intensity high, and it prevents plateaus for multiple reasons as well too there. So really my goal with clients is I want to balance science of, all right, we know we don't want to change it too often, but I have to also balance individual motivation, because I also need to make sure that whatever we're doing, you can stick to it long-term, because that's ultimately what is going to change body composition, is just the time aspect. The longer we can go and the more consistent we can be, the better things are going to be. Some people will see better results in the short term than others, but ultimately what's going to be one deciding factor for any good physique that you see or anyone that has built a substantial amount of muscle or anything like that. It's going to be time. They've just been doing it for a while there. So really it does become, okay, how do we manage injury? How do we minimize injury risk? How do we keep you motivated? How do we keep you pushing for the long term? And this is where I think we need to find that balance of keeping things the same, but then also changing things up and being strategic with our changes too, right? Not just necessarily, hey, just changing things for change's sake there. And I think anytime I talk to clients about this, I'm always just checking in with these things. Hey, you've been in a training cycle for X weeks. How are things feeling? Getting their biofeedback in terms of how they're feeling from day to day. Are they progressing? How are they feeling in their workouts? Things are feeling super heavy. These are all things that I'm constantly getting information on from clients because that goes into my decision process of how long there. So to sum up this first part, we want to keep things in long enough, but we also need to make changes over time to prevent overuse injuries, to prevent plateaus, to prevent boredom, and to keep motivation high there. So let's now dive into the next part of this and talk about the optimal length of a training cycle. What does that look like? How long does it need to be? I would say for most clients, I'm aiming now for about 6 to 12 weeks. I find that to be the most optimal length. Now, in saying that, in that 6 to 12 weeks, context does matter, right? There's no one size fits all timeline. It really depends on a lot of things within those 6 to 12 weeks. What does that look like there? Is somebody newer to training? Is someone that needs constant novelty? Does somebody do they recover well? Do they push themselves hard in their training? Because that will change it. What exercises do we have access to? What time, where they're at in their season of life, what they have going on, what their recovery is. So in saying that, it could be, I don't like to go much less than 6 weeks, but again, I'll go over some times when maybe we would do something that's less than 6 weeks. Or again, I think you could also go more than 12 weeks as well too. But once we hit that 8 to 12 week mark, that's where I am checking in with clients a bit more regularly on this and seeing what's going on and seeing how they're feeling. And what you find is that's typically when all these things start to come together, right? That's when a client will typically start to lose some motivation with what they're doing. That's when maybe they'll start to see some exercises really like maybe go backwards a little bit, or they start to get some minor aches and pains, things like some overuse type injuries there. But what I'll say is really trying to push clients closer to that 8 to 12 week mark, because that's really going to allow for like deeper adaptation and therefore progress. So really trying to get you to stay as consistent as possible for that 8 to 12 week-ish mark, and potentially even longer, right? If we can push longer, we're certainly going to do that there. But like I said, that's where you start to run into some issues and you need to potentially make a change. Shorter phases would make sense if we're going like less than 6 weeks. If life stress or fatigue gets super high, someone just has a bunch of stuff come up and it's okay, yeah, I know that ideally we want to push 6 to 12 weeks. We may need to make some adjustments here from that perspective. Maybe somebody pushed too close to failure too early, like they just went balls to the wall in week 1 and they've just been going to absolute failure for everything. That's probably going to shorten your training cycle length that you can stay in a phase before you need to make some adjustments. Or maybe you have some sort of travel or schedule changes or minor injury that we need to change. So that's where you end up falling under that. But again, if we're going to go longer, again, like 10 to 12 plus weeks, we're looking at, hey, consistency's there, recovery solid, you're feeling good, you feel like you're progressing, you're still motivated to keep pushing it. And again, we just don't see that fatigue accumulation there with that. So again, we're looking at about 6 to 12 weeks. That's what I'm trying to push clients to, but we could go a little bit longer than that and we could go a little bit shorter than that, but less likely to go shorter 99% of the time with that. I'll talk about how to transition between phases. What does that look like? What are some options that we have there? So we have multiple options, right? This is probably what I used to do and was like, hey, this is what things are going to look like. And I think if you are in more of a group kind of style program or group style kind of program, things aren't individualized. I think you're going to see this probably be a little bit more of like a standard stock thing where it's you're going to do X amount of weeks, you're going to deload, then you're going to go into a new training cycle. Whereas kind of what I've switched to and like to do is option 2 would be this kind of, hey, we're going to keep pushing. I don't have a set time frame of how long you're going to train for in this training cycle. And then we're going to do what after, let's say all those things, we look in to see how long they've been in a training cycle. Maybe again, motivation's dropping, which I'm going to go over here in a minute, right? We'll talk about what would be some signs. So again, 8 to 12 weeks, and then from there, we do either like a quote unquote reset week or a lighter intensity type week where we make some sort of adjustments, add in new exercises, or we kind of have this auto-regulated approach to like your training intensity for certain exercises. And that's with the new training cycle. And then you build from there, right? So instead of taking that that preset, hey, this is how many weeks we're doing. Then we're doing a preset deload where you're doing whatever. And then we're going into a new cycle. My kind of new approach is, hey, we're going to see how long we can milk out the training cycle for. Then we're going to get some new exercises in based on what you have, what we feel like you need to make changes to. And again, maybe it's not necessarily a full on deload week where it's like, hey, you're going in and not really doing much. Maybe it's an auto-regulated approach. You have one day that you do go a little bit lighter. Maybe we're keeping weight the same and we're just doing a few less reps in sets. Or maybe it's, hey, we're keeping, if you were training 0 RAR on your isolation, maybe we're going back closer to 2 RAR, and then any new exercises that we have in, we're easing you back in. So that's a reset week 1 of your quote unquote new training cycle versus that standard kind of deload week there. But we're also going to align this with we're going to align this with transition. We're going to align these transitions with life events, right? So again, if we have travel, vacation, we're obviously that's going to be a more preset kind of thing that we're doing versus everything is always X amount of weeks then a deload on there. So we we'll align that transition with any life events that we have on there. All right, let's talk about, deloads, like to deload or not to deload. So there was a study by Max Coleman et al. Within the last couple of years, I don't know the exact year, but basically it was a 9-week program comparing deload versus non-deload groups. And so what they did is it was essentially, they looked at strength and muscle growth. And in the 9 weeks, the group that did, so one group trained straight through, and then one group midway through took a deload week and then transition, right? So from a muscle growth standpoint, there was no difference. The only thing that was different was strength was slightly lower in the deload group. However, the kind of counter to that could potentially be in that deload week, they didn't do absolutely anything, right? Like most people aren't going to do absolutely nothing, which if you have to, you found out in this 9-week study that there was no difference from a muscle building standpoint. Strength was just a little bit lower. And that probably has to come back to what I said earlier about the skill component of strength. Whereas if you do miss an entire week and don't practice that movement, you might have a decrease in skill. And that's going to be the bigger thing at play there is the skill, not necessarily like you just lost all the strength there, right? So I think what that means really is that you could take a deload and it's not necessarily going to harm you in, say, 9 weeks. So if you need to absolutely take an entire week off, you're probably good to go. Strength might be impacted slightly, but you can get that skill and strength back fairly quickly there. So that tells us that we don't need to deload, but we also can, and it's not going to be detrimental. Now, in saying that, this was only 9 weeks. Okay, what would that look like over a year? If you did deload every 4 weeks, would you have less muscle growth because you took a week off every 4 weeks? Or if you just kept pushing, would you eventually need to take a deload anyways? So it's hard to say. It's hard to run these studies to be longer than 9 weeks or anything like that. So we don't know for sure. But in the short term, if you absolutely need to take one for whatever reason, you could do it and you don't have to worry about losing any gains. Now, in saying that, I would try and avoid taking an entire week off. I would still try and do something, even if it's just a little bit and way less than what you typically do. That's going to be better than nothing. My kind of thought on this is most need for deloads, though, is poor programming, intensity, or recovery, right? Like at the end of the day, most people will be like, hey, if I have a week like where I'm feeling a bit tired, they'll automatically assume, hey, I need to take a deload. And it's okay, do we actually need to take a deload there? You probably don't have to. We'll talk about some things that we'll look at here and some other ways to manage that if you're feeling fatigued. But like I said, most deloads are from poor programming, intensity, or recovery. And what I mean by that is poor programming. You just don't have it set up in a way that's going to manage overall fatigue. Intensity, like somebody just always trains to failure all the time. Like that's going to be the big thing. And then also just lack of recovery. So what are things outside of the gym? Like those are typically the bottlenecks before it's, hey, you actually need to just take time off of training, right? Again, that could happen, but in most cases that's the issue. Whereas once you start learning, once you get better programming, once you learn how to manage your intensity and you improve things outside of the gym, your need for like true actual deload weeks, where again, we'll talk about there's different ways to deload, but again, if you needed to take an entire week off or again, every single day you went in for an entire week was just like less weight, less reps, less volume, you probably don't need to do that there. But saying that, deloads don't harm progress as we saw in the short term, but they're not always necessary, right? And what I like to do now with deloads is use them reactively, not on a fixed schedule. And I'm also less likely to just use a full on deload week in general anymore, unless again, it's travel, there's other things going on in their life, et cetera. But again, there's other things that we can do to manage that versus taking a full on deload week on there. And I also think it's especially unnecessary for those only training 2 to 3 days a week. I would do this in the past where it's like somebody would train 3 days a week and I'd have them deload every 6 to 10 weeks. Okay, you're just simply not training enough. I think they become more necessary and mandatory the more you train. But in saying that, I think if we take care of those other things, your need for deload becomes less. And like I said, I'm just much less likely to use deloads now for muscle growth in general. And so like I think a better setup to this is instead of, here's some ways that you can make sure that you don't need to deload as often. One, train two to three RIR on compound type stuff. Again, your bigger lifts, right? Anything that uses large amounts of muscle, bigger muscle groups. Again, your typical barbell, back squat stuff, even something like a hack squat. Again, just heavier lifts, Romanian deadlifts, things like that. Probably staying a rep or two away from failure on those most of the time is going to be a good idea. And then on your isolation, machine-based type stuff, maybe now we're looking at training closer to 0 to 2 RIR most of the time, right? That right there should help you get to the point where you don't necessarily feel like you need to deload. But taking an auto-regulatory approach, meaning depending on how you feel that day, maybe you're not training 0 RIR on your isolation stuff. Maybe you're training closer to 2 RIR, depending on how you feel. Maybe for your compound stuff, you're training closer to 3 to 4 RIR for one day. And that's what you need specifically there, right? So having an auto-regulatory approach to deloads or to these days can help push things out to where you don't necessarily need to take a full-on load week. I also think improving your cardiovascular fitness helps recovery, helps you be able to handle more. And so you have a less of a need to feel like you need to do deloads. Now, saying that, you obviously need to do your cardiovascular fitness. And so now the trick becomes, how do you balance all those things in to where you don't feel like you need to deload too, right? So you need to look at that. And then obviously like more focus on recovery outside of the gym, proper nutrition, good circadian rhythm habits, stress load management, just getting good quality sleep. These are all things that can help you recover. And again, your need to actually take like a true deload goes down there. So let's now talk about some potential like deload options that you could do, right? So you obviously have your traditional deloads where it's like, hey, you're maybe training less, you're doing reduced volume, you're reducing your intensity. Like that would be your more traditional deload. And to me, you're doing that throughout the entire week, no matter what. You're doing that across the board. You're doing that for everything there, right? And so that would be your sort of traditional deload with that. Whereas instead, what I like to do is auto-regulate at lighter days. So instead, insert lighter days based on readiness and fatigue. So maybe again, like I was saying with your compound stuff, you're doing closer to 3 to 4 RIR instead of one specific day, instead of doing 1 to 2 RIR. Do 2 sets instead of 3. So instead of hitting that third set, maybe you're just doing 2 that day. Again, lower or increase your RIR to make it easier. And again, maybe you're just doing this on specific muscle groups, right? Something that is extra sore versus, hey, I'm just going to deload everything. Maybe you just do this on if your lower body's a bit more sore and you know that fatigues you the most. All right, that's what I'm going to deload on or take a lighter day with there, right? And again, you can do these as often as you want. And again, this usually will extend that training cycle and lower your need to take a deload there. So again, those are ways that we can do it. And then obviously we have the sort of reset or pivot weeks. This is where, again, it's like, hey, you've been doing a training cycle for 8 to 12 weeks. All right, a lot of things I'm going to keep relatively the same, but I'm going to change out some exercises, maybe change out my training days, et cetera. I'll talk about adjustments that we can make. And that would be your kind of pivot week into week 1 of the next training cycle on there. And that's what we're doing with that. And again, maybe you use a couple auto-regulated lighter days in that first week, or again, you just do it on your new exercises or on certain exercises that you are just feeling burnt out on, right? So it's like, all right, week 9, you're like, okay, I'm done with that training cycle. I'm going to make some adjustments I'm going to change some movements around. I'm going to change maybe my rep range slightly on a few exercises, change the exercise order. All right, now that's quote unquote, now I'm going into week 1 of a new training cycle. And maybe there was an exercise that's been bothering you. It's just weighing on you a lot. All right, that's the one you're going to drop to 2 sets. You're going to do your RIR is going to change on that from say 0 to 1 now to 2 to 3. But if you have an exercise that's feeling really good, hey, I'm going to just keep sticking it 1 to 2 RIR on that one and keep progressing that one. And then any new exercises you add in, you're obviously starting to get that one dialed in, right? And so now you can start to see where we can really start to string together multiple cycles here in a row without really having the need to take that full week at lower frequency, lower volume, lower intensity. Now, saying that, there's no downside to doing it, but is it necessary there? So what are some signs that it is time to sort of transition, right? So it's like, hey, you're getting into week 8 to 12. What are some signs that you either need to take a full on deload or transition, right? So you're looking at persistent fatigue and low motivation towards your training that's been going on for multiple weeks, right? Again, one day of that happening, maybe you insert a auto-regulatory day, a lighter day, see if that changes anything. You are getting those joint aches or nagging pain. Again, look to see if you can just add in one of those. Could you also improve your nutrition? Could you improve your recovery there? Progress starts to stall across multiple sessions in a row, or it regresses across multiple sessions. That's where you'd want to potentially look into it. But again, if you have one day where you're doing the same as last week, and it feels a little bit harder, that's not necessarily a sign that you need to change anything per se yet. And also, if you have one session where things maybe start to, you regress a little bit, again, not necessarily a sign that you need to change just yet. Poor performance despite good recovery input. So again, you are really got sleep dialed in, you're eating at maintenance or higher, you're eating carbs, et cetera. And then lastly, you've been in the same training cycle for 8 to 12 plus weeks, and you just need novelty or some fresh focus. Because again, I do think there's some benefit to novelty. It's just we don't want to overuse novelty there, right? So it's like, all right, you've been in a training cycle for 10 weeks, motivation's low, you've had some joint aches or nagging pain. We already took a day where you backed off on certain exercises or the entire session. And now we're starting to see things are starting to regress in terms of your progressions. And again, you've really got sleep and everything dialed in. All right, now it's time to change things up, right? So again, we're looking at short-term fatigue, whether you get maybe it's a poor night's sleep you got, maybe you are in a deficit. So maybe you take a refeed day, maybe stress has been a bit high, then that's where you would take that lighter day, right? But again, now we're looking at more accumulated fatigue, weeks of hard training, then that's where we would start to make that transition, right? So all those things are things that I'm taking into consideration there when making those adjustments. Cool. All right, let's now switch to adjustments between phases. So let's talk about what that process may look like. So assuming muscle growth remains a goal, because that is important. If it's not, and you're switching focuses either from like a performance standpoint or more like a strength, or just, again, you're not doing your general hypertrophy style training, then you're obviously going to make more changes. But this is just under your assumption of maybe you're in a building phase and you did just finish your first training cycle. Now you're going into your second one, but you want muscle growth continues to be the main goal that we figure that's the case. You're going to have less changes. But if it's, for example, for me, I'm in like my fourth-ish cycle of this building phase, and I started off with 3 days of weight training, 3 days of cardio. Then the last 2 training cycles, I did 4 days of weights, 2 days of cardio, and then now I'm switching back, and so to 3 and 3. And so now you can start to see where there's going to be a bit more change from those transitions. Whereas if it was, hey, I'm sticking to 4 days, I'm going to have less changes on there. It's important to distinguish between that, but we're assuming that muscle growth remains the goal. So some possible changes. I'm looking at making about 2 to 3 changes per workout. Okay. So maybe we're swapping a few exercises. So and this is per workout, right? So we're keeping about 70 to 80% of the workout the same, but we're just swapping a few exercises. Maybe we're going to make some rep range adjustments. So you've been training in that 6 to 10 rep range on certain lifts for a long time. Maybe we're going to go to 10 to 15. And again, it needs to make sense for that specific exercise, right? I'm not going to change back squats to 10 to 15 there. So it does depend on that, but maybe we're going to make so you change 2 exercises, and then on 1 exercise in the workout, you're going from 6 to 10 to 15. We can adjust the set structure, right? We can add rest pause. We can add some supersets. We can maybe focus a bit more on eccentrics. Maybe we're going to change the focus of the order, right? So it's day 1 is chest, and then we go back. But maybe now our first workout of the week where you're the most fresh is going to go back and then chest, right? So you can change the exercise order. Or maybe your arms have always just been thrown at the bottom. Maybe we're going to bump those up there. And again, we're looking at small form tweaks. Maybe we're going to focus on tempo a little bit more. Maybe we're going to switch to the single leg version of something more unilateral, or maybe we're going to slightly change like the range of motion. Hey, you're going to focus more on length and partials here, right? Again, just an example. I'm less keen to do those, but that can definitely happen there. So those would be some small adjustments that we would make, right? It could be the order of the workouts, the priority of the workouts. It could be just swapping a few exercises and in a combination of all these. But those are the most common changes that I'll make from one cycle to the next. And again, we're not obviously knowing the client, how long they've been doing something, where they're at. These are all going to determine like how much I change, but we're still going to have some exercises that stay the same, which leads me to my next point here. And it's how long to keep an exercise in. So it's like, all right, we know, hey, every 8 to 12-ish weeks, I'm going to go to a new training cycle or something like that. But I'm also not going to change every single exercise. So how long do I keep something in? Because I also don't like to just, like I said, completely change everything there, right? Like I still want some things that have been feeling good to stay in if that's the case. So that leads me to my point. Keep it as long as it feels good and is progressing. So if something feels really good, you've had it in for 1 training cycle, like I'm more likely to keep that going. And so most exercises are going to stay in on a cycle of about 2 to 4 training cycles. Now, obviously the better something feels, the more you're progressing on it, the more motivated you are. It aligns with limited equipment access, like something's going to stay in for extended periods of time. So like, for example, my back squats I've kept in, like I didn't do them for a really long time and now I have them back in. And the biggest reason I'm keeping them in is because I don't have a hack squat. I don't have a leg press. And so that's my best kind of movement from like a compound standpoint to keep in. So it's not necessarily my favorite and not necessarily something I want to necessarily keep in. See how many times I can say necessary, but I do keep it in for those reasons there. So I try and keep something in as long as possible, but you would also have to consider equipment availability, right? So another one would be my cable chest press. Like I've kept that in for so long, like it feels good. I like it. I'm still progressing a little bit, obviously a lot slower. And I don't have a chest press machine that I can use. So that's why it's been in for so long. Now, obviously that comes with some downsides as well too. So you need to weigh those out there. For me though, I'm definitely at the point in my training where I just want to do what's effective, and yeah, having some fun is fine, but that's less important to me. Whereas again, for some people, it's like they need a little bit more of that. And that comes back to the individual psychology of the person that you're working with. If it's causing discomfort still or unmotivating after 2 to 3 cycles, then I definitely think we should replace it. So if it's been something that now is not feeling as good, you're unmotivated to do it, you've done it for at least one training cycle, then it's time to switch it out there, right? What you wouldn't want to do is, hey, 4 weeks in, it's a new exercise, give it some time. We have to give it some time. Sometimes I've seen it where it's like the first training cycle wasn't good, but then you're like something clicks and you start to do it better, or it's in a different spot in the workout and it's completely different and it feels good there. And so again, no need to replace every exercise at once. Like small rotations are more than enough here. I think I've had this question in the past. Can you keep an exercise up to two years? Like 100%, you totally can do that. Like you could have some options of changing the rep range a little bit. You have options of slightly changing the grip on it, slightly changing the setup. And so you could really milk something out for really long periods of time with just making small adjustments to it. Or you could just keep it in the same rep range and keep it there for as long as you want as well too. So you could totally do that with certain exercises. Like there's no, hey, you have to change this after a certain amount of time. I think you'll reach that point at some point, depending on equipment, access, injuries, focus, etc. Like at some point, something will probably come out, but maybe not. Maybe there's one exercise that someone's like, I'm keeping this in no matter what. Like I said, how I've been with my training recently being at home, I don't think I've had anything necessarily been in the entire time, but yeah, there's things that have been in for a while. The ones that I mentioned for sure there. Plus too, like a lot of times, man, there's only so many exercises that you can freaking do. It's not like there's this endless amount of some secret database of these crazy exercises. And I think that's why some people eventually get to this point where they're like, they do these kind of crazy exercises is just to keep things novel. And again, there's just so much, right? It's like when you think of curling, it's like, there's only so many variations of a curl. Yeah, you could do like a spider curl. You could do facing cable. You could do face away. You could do dumbbell bicep curl. But at the end of the day, it's just a different variations of curls that you're doing. Triceps, same thing. It's like when we look at, okay, how do we want to hit our tricep? I want to do something that's overhead once. There's only so many things you can do overhead. My favorite ends up being a cable overhead, and it's dumbbells are fine if that's all you have, but you end up doing a lot of like single arm overhead cable stuff for that, right? So there is only so many changes you can make with things. And it's not like there's just this secret database of exercises that we can pull from. But that's where I think, again, you have this rotation and you rotate things in and out. Because again, if you take something out, sometimes all you need is a couple training cycles off of it and it comes back, you come back and you're like, wow, this feels so much better. I have a little bit more muscle. Maybe I train things slightly different. And now, that's enough to push that exercise there. Cool. Let's talk key takeaways. So again, 6 to 12 weeks is a sweet spot for most training cycles for muscle growth. But again, we can certainly go longer than that. Adjust based on recovery, lifestyle, and progress. Again, deloads are a tool. Like, again, I'm less likely to use them now. I gave you some ways to work around that and what to do instead of deloads. And combine structured and auto-regulated approaches. And again, don't overthink timelines. Listen to your body and stay consistent with the principles there. But again, find that sweet spot. Like I said, 8 to 12 weeks tends to be that for most clients when it comes to muscle growth there. So cool. All right, guys, that's it for this episode. I hope this was helpful. If you found this podcast be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, that'll help more people find it. If you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. And then this is something you want to try this approach with me. That's obviously what I work on with clients inside my performance recomp method, which is my one-on-one coaching. That's just my system and methodology that I use within that. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can fill out the link in the show notes or just reach out to me on Instagram and more than happy to chat about that in more detail. That's it for this episode. Talk to you guys.